It's my distinct pleasure to have moderating this interview and Q&A a very good friend of mine, somebody who I've looked up to for so long because of her skill. We have Pamela Wu, whose award-winning career spans the fields of broadcast journalism, public relations, and communications training. Currently, she is Director of News and Media Relations for UC Davis Health, one of the nation's leading academic health systems. Since 2017, she has led a team that produces award-winning health stories. In 2021, she received an Emmy Award in the category of health medical long-form content. She previously served as Executive Director of Marketing and Communications at UC Davis School of Law. Pamela had joined UC Davis in 2009, following a career as a television news anchor and reporter, where I was a big fan watching her on KCRA Channel 3. She was nominated for an Emmy Award for her work as host of the Cultural Affairs program, KCRA 3 Common Ground, and received the Unity Award in Media for political reporting. She continues her work in broadcasting as a contributor for Capital Public Radio and Sacramento's NPR station. She is a substitute host for Insight, the station's daily public affairs program, and she hosted a Cap Radio healthcare documentary that won her a 2012 Edward R. Murrow Award. Very impressive. She has also served on the national and Sacramento chapters of the Asian American Journalists Association, which is so critical right now to support journalism in our current political environment. They're the only ones who are really trying to keep our democracy still together. She's a founding co-director of AAJA's Media Institute, a program in which top journalists and communicators train thought leaders to become valuable sources to the media. And in 2015, she was named AAJA's Member of the Year for excellence in service to the organization and journalism industry. Pam holds a degree in rhetoric and communications from UC Davis, go Aggies, where she is a member of the prestigious Integrated Studies Honors Program. Let's give her a hand. So fire away, Pam.
All right. First of all, I would like to say you provided the book to me this week. I have devoured most of it very quickly because it is truly excellent. I'm wondering how many in the room have read or started the book so far? You have a lot of fans already. Look at your readership, Bill.
I made it a very short book just for that reason.
A little worried about our attention span or something?
I was worried about my attention span. I didn't think I was going to finish it.
What inspired Better to Win?
I had left a career of 30 years in the world of politics, and we're at an inflection point, not just for the Asian American community, after so many years of anti-Asian hate and fear and post-COVID prejudice and discrimination, but also a threat to our democracy. And what I started to see is that both the Asian American community as well as the general public feel very helpless with regard to how to fix things. And things do feel like they're broken. And as I was watching this, what I saw is the way they addressed it was to yell at Twitter or yell at Instagram or yell in the middle of the street. And I felt like people needed to at least have an alternate way of trying to address their feelings. Instead of just being angry and just expressing angry, how can they actually change things and to show them a path that things have changed. But it's not necessarily simple. It's not as simple as just having the right idea. It's about doing the dirty work. It's the kind of the grunt work that's involved in it, negotiations, the very small things that bring people across the aisle in order to come to an agreement and work together.
So you had a real vision, and I know that it's very hard, right, to encapsulate these thoughts, articulate them, and then put them down on paper, or in your case, a computer. Was that the hardest thing about writing this book? What were some of the hard parts of writing it?
The hardest part about it really was my fear that I would never finish, because the scariest thing that you'll ever find is a blank piece of paper. It's like, where do you start? And that was hard, but one of the things, luckily in the world of politics, is you learn that the most powerful way to persuade people is to tell a story. So instead of trying to come up with a lot of statistics and really deep thoughts, I just want to tell some of the stories, because that's how I learned. When you see other people, how they conduct themselves or their victories, you learn, oh, it can be done, and you can take that model, and I think that that's the better way to change people's minds.
Storytelling is obviously very effective. There are amazing stories in this book from across your 30-year career. You open with a section on leadership, and you focus on an apology. Can you tell us more about why this story was important for you to include about the apology?
First thing, this story has such a tremendous impact on my trajectory as a person. But secondly, in the last 10 years, I go to a lot of leadership trainings. I participate in a lot of panels. And when we talk about leadership, we talk about what looks like leadership, like what your title is, what your pay rate is, what suits you wear, what company you work for, what organization you work for, those types of things. And we don't talk about leadership in terms of character, in terms of values. And I think that we've lost the emphasis on the foundation for leadership are those types of things. And so this story, if you haven't read it, is that I played football. I was a World War football player. And we had a star running back. And one day he lost his temper at a teammate who was one of the second string teammates in there. And it happens on a regular basis. We mess up all the time. We were like a horrible football team. When we were done with practice, we went in and he was our star running back. He had already been accepted to Cal, full ride. He was dating a cheerleader, like all the things that were important to you when you were in high school. So he was like iconic. And then he goes up to this player and apologizes to him. And the power dynamic was different. The player was just an average player. And this
was considered to be a team leader.
Yeah, exactly. So for him to not be scared to apologize for making a mistake, I thought was the most life-changing example of leadership I'd ever seen before. And at that moment I said, if there's one thing I could do right in my life is to be able to do that one day. Like I didn't think I was there at the time because I was too busy trying to be accepted and too busy trying to check all the boxes. But clearly he didn't care if people thought that was a sign of weakness. It just it just made me think that he was such a strong person to be able to do that.
I really enjoyed reading that story, and two words that came to mind for me were humility and character. In addition to humility and character, what other words would you use to describe important traits in leaders? It's sort of like servant leaders, as I hear you describing.
Simon Sinek says that you're not in charge of people. You're responsible for the people that are in your charge. So it's that type of compassion and empathy that you have to have. And I think that when we talk about leadership, it's all about being strong. But in my years as a chief of staff, you realize you have to be a really good listener. You have to be one who looks beyond what's on the superficial in order to be a good leader. And the good leader is the person who keeps everybody together, not necessarily the person that's just at the head of the line.
A lot of the stories of political leadership that you write about in Better to Win involve women. In your experience, how do you think AAPI women approach politics and leadership differently than men?
No offense to all the men here.
Right? Hashtag not all men.
But, I interview a lot of candidates, and the men are like, how do I look like a leader? Like, they're looking at the accoutrements. Like, I went to Harvard, I went to the U.S. Naval Academy, I went to West Point. They checked all the boxes.
And credentials.
Yeah, they're credentials-driven people. But when I work with the women, they're like, what's messed up, and how do we fix it? And that's really the difference that I really felt in my experience working for men and women. And not that the men weren't bad people, but it definitely was a different experience because Hilda Sleece, Judy Chu, they're always trying to fix stuff that was wrong, and they were driven by that. Not to say that the men like Dr. Pan obviously has done some tremendous work, but I would say he's the exception because I talked to a lot of the men, and all they could do is try to do shock and awe with their resume. It's like, I don't really care. Like, there's this person running for Congress in Southern California, and it's like, oh, went to Harvard, Rhodes Scholar. It's like nobody in that district cares. They want to know how they're going to pay for milk.
Yes.
And it's that type of mentality that really is. I feel this is the difference.
Ladies in the room, I'm getting flashbacks to my earlier pre-marriage dating life where you'd go on a first date with a guy and he would totally run down his resume. I'm just trying to figure out if we get along. Apparently the same with candidate interviews. So a lot of AAPIs experience, of course, bias when it comes to being seen or treated as a leader in, when the powers that be are seeking leadership potential. What are your thoughts on the so-called bamboo ceiling?
I think that ceiling exists in part because of us. It's very similar to when you're saying stop API hate. Who are you talking to? And when you say, I want the bamboo ceiling gone, who are you talking to? You're talking to people who have established those barriers for you. And whenever you're talking from that perspective, you're in a subservient role. You're asking somebody to fix your problem. And what I propose, I think, in the book is fix the problem yourself by removing those people from that situation. So if you want to be a leader, then take over the company or build the company that's going to, put that other company out of business instead of asking for somebody's approval. And it's not obvious, but it's inherent in the question. It's like, who do we need to impress in order to become a CEO? It's like, you don't need to impress anybody to become a CEO. You just have to become a CEO and then eat the rest of the competition.
Like how you're talking about not working within the existing box, but breaking the box and building a new box. So an equine analogy here. In the world of leadership training, are we producing show ponies or war horses? Because you've talked about sort of like the standards for career success. What's your salary? What's your title? Where'd you go to school? What suit are you wearing? But how much should the focus instead be on things like earning respect, sharpening skills, problem solving?
I think it should all be on there, but I think the problem is mechanics. Because if you look at all of our leadership training programs, even our higher education programs, you're just sitting in a room listening. You're not doing. When I first started in ethnic studies in Davis, I think Asian American studies was based on community organizing. So they said, get out there and do something. They didn't just say, like, sit in this room and write a paper. But that has changed. Academia has changed in the sense that you're just reading about other people's exploits. You're trying to follow somebody else's written model about what it is. So, like, I could read every book on basketball. I will never be an NBA champion unless I get on the court. So I think that for us, if you want to be a leader, you have to go out there and participate in activities that require leadership, like even if it's team sports or community organizing or party, political party activism or campaigns, and risk the possibility of failure, because that also builds character. Failure always builds character.
Yes.
But learn how to work with people, how to share power, how to, acquire power. But that's all based upon activity, not reading. And, as much as I'm a big fan of reading, I want people to experience these types of things. And I don't really think that our current academic system or the leadership trainings that are out there really do that. I've always joked that if you want to have like a leadership program, you should just take 10 people out into the forest, leave them there for 2 weeks. And if they get out, they're leaders. If they don't, well, maybe they should be leaders.
Sorry.
Right.
Yeah. Leave you to the bears.
Yeah.
So you were an Asian American Studies major in college. Is that?
There was no major when I was there. In fact, it was only a program and you could only get a minor.
Oh, okay. So what was your major?
Poli-sci.
Poli-sci with a minor in Asian American Studies. So is that when you decided that you wanted to work in politics?
Well, as my wife will always laugh about, I spent 3 years studying engineering like every good Asian American. Realized I was very horrible at it, failing calculus 3 times. Calculus 1, the lowest calculus. 3 times should have been a signal, but I'm a little bit hard-headed.
You're like, this third time, I'm going to ace it.
So 3 years into it, the counselors at Davis said, Mr. Wong, you need to make some changes, otherwise you should leave. So I went down the course catalog with the major that required the least amount of units to graduate, and it happened to be political science. And there I was, and then I got an internship with mainly Tom and Georgette Murrah, and then that's the Lundgren fight, and then that was like, oh my God, politics is the great equalizer here, because there's these 2 women that took on, a congressman who was groomed to be the next state treasurer by the governor of California and beat him. And I said, well, they can beat, anything can be done.
Yeah. And I love that you give a lot of credit to Mainly and Georgette in the book, too. I really enjoyed seeing their names there. I know that they've inspired you. Which AAPI elected official or officials have inspired you as well?
Well, definitely Judy Chu has been like the most. I mean, she was fearless in every fight that she'd been in. She was the underdog. Again, she didn't ask for permission to run. She, felt that she needed to represent the area. She represented Monterey Park, San Gabriel Valley, which is at now the only Voting Rights Act Asian majority district in the state. And there were a lot of efforts to prevent that from happening, from it being represented by an Asian American. And even before that, when she had actually got into elected office, because there was a racist effort to prevent local Chinese shop owners from having signs in their store that were in Chinese. They had to be in English. So it was this English-only movement that was going on. So that, and she actually was like an anti-nuclear and anti-war activist early in college. So she had always been a fighter, and seeing her get into these fights and never bend to whether it was Democratic leadership or any of the opponents that she ran against. She was absolutely fearless.
Speaking of fearless, I think that a lot of the stories that you tell, I felt like reading this, like, wow, Bill is really fearless. I feel like there's some great strategy secrets in this book. And so when do you decide to fight? When do you decide to go against the grain, pick a fight? And when you do that, how do you sort of master the art of effectively defeating those in power? Like, what quick tips can you give us so that we're all better warriors when we leave this room today?
Well, first of all, one of my football coaches once told me, Bill, there's a very fine line that separates courage from stupidity. So early on, I've always been a little bit hard-headed, so getting into a fight was not hard, but learning how to win them was different. But instead of being the loudest, there are so many different strategies and techniques to balance the playing field. I used the example of Thermopylae, how 300 Spartans held off the Persian army because they fought them on their turf where it was much more narrow, and the 100,000 Persians couldn't take advantage of that situation because you could only fit 20 people in that gorge. So there are things to think about it from that perspective, but we are so distracted by who's louder or who's prettier or who's whatever, instead of using those advantages that you have. And these are techniques that are being used right now. You go into certain executive offices, and the president of the company is always going to sit higher and behind a bigger desk than you, and that's intentional to make you feel small. If you know that these manipulations are in play, you can also utilize those to balance the playing field. I was talking to a group of CEO women. I said, instead of going to where all the old boys are hanging out for whiskey, you force them into a bar that you have control over, that where all your friends are at, where it's like the women outnumber the men 2-1, and then psychologically, they won't know what's going on, but they will feel weaker. They'll feel more at a disadvantage, and then that's when you have an advantage to persuade them the way you want to persuade them. I actually told another mentee, this is part of the diabolical sector, when you get to a meeting, go early, push all the other chairs down, and make sure your chair's high. She's already tall, but you get everybody in an initial subservient position, and that mindset stays even if they lift up their chair because they started off lower. And then that is a temporary emotional and psychological advantage in a situation that you can take and utilize to your advantage if you're in a negotiating situation.
I love it. And these are lessons too that I share with mentees in communications, right? Where can you win? Where can you set things up so that you have the advantage? And where can I move the needle most effectively? And it really is about moving the needle and not just about shouting on Twitter, like you said.
Exactly.
In the book, there's a really interesting quote. It says, status is conferred and power is acquired. Can you talk about the difference between status and power?
I put that in there intentionally because Asians are very status oriented. Whether we want to admit it or not, it's like what car you drive, what degrees, like everybody went to Stanford, everybody went to Cal, everybody went to Harvard. Like that is like the end all be all. If you don't go to Harvard, your life is ruined. And, but that's also, you're just trying to impress somebody because that degree doesn't necessarily guarantee you success. It guarantees you access to good education, but whether or not you take advantage of it, it's a whole different thing. But we really don't care. I mean, the truth is that we don't really care what education we got. We just care about the diploma. So that's all confirmed. Appointments. When you're appointed to a board position or commission, you have some limited power, but that could always be taken away from you. But if you have power, like if you understand how people think psychologically, nobody could take that away. If you have knowledge, if you have not only historic knowledge, but knowledge of your opponent, that's something that they can't take away from you. Those are advantages that you hold and you keep, that nobody can take that away from you. That's things that you can acquire in your journey. Knowledge about people, knowledge about your geography, where you're stronger and where you're not stronger, where you can put a play into act where you have the largest benefit. That's power. That's utilizing those things that nobody can take away from you.
We were talking earlier about not working within the existing box, but creating your own box, breaking the box and making your own. Can you talk about how this relates to so-called honorary whiteness and the model minority myth?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of built in. And for those of you who've watched Beef, I haven't watched it yet, but they talk about how the nuanced message in it is this subtle compulsion for Asian Americans to want honorary whiteness. And there's a certain institutional motion of being the honorary, white minority that's used to pit us against other communities of color in very kind of subtle but pernicious ways to fill a certain narrative. And I know it's hard because you don't want to be the outcast. In fact, in the world of politics and messaging, you know that peer pressure is one of the most effective ways to persuade people. So wanting to be a part of a group and be part of a tribe and accept it is a very powerful way to promote compliance. And we are complicit in that compliance. That complicity of that comfort and those advantages is being used, and not that you should feel like intentionally guilty for it, but we are being used by a system to put other people in a worse position.
And to sort of fight for the crumbs.
It's like the Hunger Games.
Yeah.
And again, that is a myth because, why not just take the whole pie and redistribute it?
Right. Or be like, Katniss and turn the whole thing upside down like she did in the Hunger Games.
Exactly.
Yes. The last few years have been so weird politically, right? So what do you see in the future for AAPS in this post-Trump era?
I'm hoping that this is an inflection point. I think that there are questions being asked, and I think that you start to see change. You've seen change in media, like more representation, more stories, more activity. If you really look at some of the actions in the states with regard to AAPI voters, they were the margin of victory in a lot of these key campaigns with regard to allowing Democrats to hold the Senate with victories in Nevada and Georgia and then also Pennsylvania. And then we'll be big players in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania again next cycle. So you really see that the turnout is there. You've seen like the explosion. I think this last cycle was the first time you saw Asian American 501c4 organizations, which are organizations that are allowed to politically participate, as opposed to C3 organizations, which are nonprofits that are not allowed to participate politically. So you're seeing a change in the community becoming more political. Now, are they getting there fast enough? Do they have the skills enough to be effective? That's a whole other story, but at least we've made that turn.
I have one more question for you, and it's like this burning question, but I'm going to save it for the very end. Until then, I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience. I know that a lot of you have been chatting with Bill. Everyone has a lot of curiosity about the book. I invite you to raise your hand if you have a question for Bill. Dr. Pam.
So first of all, Bill, amazing book. I actually read it in one sitting. First of all, can you maybe speak to, you didn't talk directly in the book about this, you talked about so many campaigns, the fact that, we're here at the CDP headquarters, that those Asian American candidates that flipped perhaps more seats, from Republicans to Dem, in the last 15 years, what's your thoughts about why that's the case? And then the second part, the API community, we're very diverse. We don't always support each other. And what's your perspective on that as we are trying to find our place and take our place actually at the tables of power?
Yeah, great question. Thank you, Dr. Pan. I think for your first question about the overall environment, in California alone, Asian Democrats outnumber Asian Republicans almost 2 to 1. And then there's a large group of Asians who are no party preference or decline to state voters, which, depending upon where they live, can tend either way, but predominantly they shift to Democratic voters. That's why the majority of the elected officials in California who are Asian American are Democrats as opposed to Republicans. There are a few Republicans, but it is also something that I think that it's important. I talk to a lot of Republicans. I'm happy to work with Republicans on where we can find places to meet, and that's important because our community is not monolithic. We have to understand that there are different perspectives and respect that instead of just going one way or the other. So, it's even though we still outnumber Republicans, it's very important for us to respect what is being said in those communities and why that's important to them. Otherwise, you're going to lose seats because we lost Democratic seats in New York, in Chinatown, because the Democratic Party in New York did not pay attention to Asian American voters. That's a message to the Democratic Party establishment, is that you cannot ignore the Asian American voters, regardless of how they register to vote. And then the second question is about sometimes we don't help each other. Well, it's like most of the time, as you've experienced, Dr. Pan, it's very difficult to get other Asians to support other elected officials. And it's something that I think is a residual of that kind of valedictorian complex that we've kind of grown up with, the Hunger Games of like there can only be one and you can't share the spotlight. I always feel like when I meet a lot of Asians, they are into individualized sports, and fewer of them play team sports, and there's a different perspective. Even like team sports that are like tennis, where everybody is on a team, but their individual performance is more still playing singles. So I think it's something that we have to grow out of, and that we have to nurture and promote in order for us to overcome that. It's not an epiphany. It's going to take repetitions. It's going to take practice for us to get to that point.
A couple questions. One is why Democrats versus Republicans versus decline the state. And second, with the presumption you answer why Democrats. The New York Times wrote an article in March which reflected a little bit of what you're saying about the shift in Asian voters. Basically was saying that the AAPI voters in New York specifically were trending toward or moving more red, but still the majority blue.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Keith, for the question. I think, when you're asking a question about why Asian Americans should register one way or the other, it ultimately becomes, again, peer pressure. So, we are all ambassadors of our beliefs. I was an immigrant. I came here in 1966 from Hong Kong. My parents were escaping communist China. We benefited from all of the public safety net that existed out there when we got here. That's why I'm a Democrat. I explained to a lot of people why I support affirmative action is because the black community got JFK elected. JFK was the one who passed the Immigration Reform Acts that allowed us to immigrate from China. We wouldn't even be here. Generations of Asian Americans would not even be here had it not been for the sacrifices of the black community that got JFK elected. So you have to understand the perspective on policy from a larger context instead of just what do I want now. And there's also something pernicious is that your life is over if you don't go to Berkeley. Like, I get it, but at the same time, there are more things that are important than just going to Cal. And particularly if you didn't go to Cal, you really don't care about going to Cal or USC or any of the other types of things like that. But, it's about politics in context, and it's also about leadership. Now, when the Latino community started getting involved heavily in Democratic parties, it wasn't just because it was organic, it's because our Torres was chair of the Democratic Party. So when Asian Americans want the Democratic Party to listen to us, it's not about talking to the chair, even though the chair is a great person. It's about taking the seats at the decision table where those decisions are being made, because they may not necessarily be intentionally ignoring you, they're just a blind spot. And if you're not at the table, you're allowing that blind spot to exist. Now, with regard to your second question, who's designing these campaigns? I've sat in so many meetings where you deal with consultants who are just going to tell you what to do, and they suggest some of the most ridiculous things. And in the book, I talk about Jerry Brown's campaign. The strategy that the outside world thinks is going to resonate with Asian Americans is usually off because they don't live that experience. So unless you have Asians at the table, you're not going to be able to communicate effectively with those voters and bring them across on election day.
Let's do a super quick, because I promised another audience question. This was like lightning round.
Yeah.
Okay, so Bill's going to give a quick answer to one more audience question. I see.
So after 4 decades of doing this, what would you do differently?
I told this to another group. It's like, one, I would have played meaner and I would have played dirtier.
Yeah. Sometimes you got to get in the mud with them, right? Okay, so I have the final question, and that is a question that I know everybody in this room wants to know the answer to. Are you really retired?
I don't know. It's a little bit like the mafia. I mean, it's hard to pull you back in. It's a little bit hard to watch what's going on, but at the same time, I haven't found the right way to get back into the game. So hopefully some epiphany will occur, and it'll show me the right path.
Congratulations on an amazing career. Amazing career so far, maybe, is what I'm hearing. The book is Better to Win. It's really an incredible accomplishment. Congratulations, Bill.
Thank you so much.